Hi, I'm Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of The Contrarian. Delighted to have with us one of our friends from the Center for American Progress, David Matlin, who oversees a group within CAP called the American Worker Project. What is that, David? And welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me. The American Worker Project focuses on how ensuring workers can have a good job with good wages and benefits and rights at work, and it promotes policies to do so.
So I'm suspecting that the current bill under the consideration that came out of the House probably doesn't do those things. What are the ways in which it is bad for working people, middle class people, and maybe all Americans?
Yeah, you're right on. It's really bad. Among the I've been in politics for many decades, and this is about the worst I can remember, because what it does is it cuts a bunch of things that workers depend on. Most importantly, their health care, Medicaid, where millions and millions of workers are going to lose the benefits that they currently enjoy. And instead, and those cost savings are going to go to create tax cuts for the rich. And one more thing that's even worse about that is the savings from the cuts are not even enough to pay for the tax cuts, so much so that we're passing on debt to future generations. And that debt is going to cause increased cost to workers today. Their credit card rates are going to go up. The interest they pay on their mortgage is going to go up. So it's really kind of this triple whammy for workers, where they lose now, they lose in the future, and they lose in many different ways.
Various explanations from the Republicans. First, they said, well, it's just going to kick illegal immigrants off of Medicaid. I thought illegal immigrants weren't on Medicaid. Secondly, they said, well, it's just to ensure that, there's not waste, fraud, and abuse. And then their latest explanation is people are going to die anyway. What does this really do? And what is their explanation for why they think this is beneficial?
I can't get into why their explanations. I mean, they don't make much sense. They're contradictory. They're really trying to justify the unjustifiable. As I started off, this is a huge cut to things workers depend on. Our lives are really at stake here, and they're doing it to cut taxes on the rich. So that I just don't. You can't really justify that. So you have to go to sort of these weird explanations that no one really follows or believes. What it's going to do, I think estimates are around 13 million workers are going to lose their health care because of this. But then you're going to compound that to spread out much further, because these cuts are going to cause things like rural hospitals to close. They're also going to cause existing hospitals that provide care for poor people to actually have to then charge up costs for people who have insurance. And so our insurance costs are going to go up. Even those of us who have insurance are going to pay more for healthcare. So this is going to have just a really downward spiral on almost everything in the healthcare market for Americans.
And I just want to point to one pernicious item, and that is they're making it much harder by throwing a lot of paperwork and nonsense to get the child tax income credit. And that is something that is a lifesaver, that has been bipartisan support, that allows lower income people who are working to get money to frankly pay for things that their kids need. So it is really I think a cruel minded bill is the only way I can describe it. I want to ask you about a poll that you guys just did on kind of views of working people and the economy. Tell us a little bit about what you found.
So yeah, we looked at polling around the right before and right after the election in 2024, and looked at the views of people who are considered working class, which is typically those without a college degree, and people who have a college degree. And we really focused on this because this is seen as the growing divide in American politics, that people with a college degree are increasingly voting for the Democratic Party, and people without a college degree are voting for Republicans. And it's seen as this, these irreconcilable differences almost. And what we looked at is a core set of economic issues, and we found there are really similar views between college and non-college workers. They want things like a higher minimum wage. They want stronger unions. They want taxes to go up on the rich. They want stronger Medicaid. and the like. And the support for these policies was not just like, oh, 51%, but like, oh, well over 60% for both college and non-college. And that is just very hard to find kind of that level of support for most anything today, and that it is on a huge range of economic policies. And so my sort of sense is there really is a way forward that brings college and non-college folks together. They want many of the same things on economic policy.
Now, one of the areas that we've always been told is a great divider is immigration. And you found that there were some differences, but there's also consensus there. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, immigration, there are sharp differences between people with college degrees and non-college degrees on sort of crackdowns and being harsher and tougher and restricting immigration. But both college and non-college workers support a pathway to citizenship that people can earn. You work here, pay taxes, don't commit crimes, and you got a pathway after a couple of years to citizenship. And so to me, that suggests again a pathway forward that we as Americans can come together. And in fact, I just had an event yesterday where I moderated a discussion with Representative Greg Casar, who represents the Progressive Caucus in Congress, and also with Representative Nikki Bedinsky, who's from the New Dems. So these are two different poles of the Democratic Party, and both talked about a path forward on immigration. Although I just want to say they both focused on the importance of economic issues. And then they said, and we can do something better and different on immigration, and we need to do so. So to me, these are all signs there's a path forward that can unite much of the country.
If the polls are accurate and they're so overwhelmingly determinative on these various positions, so even if there's a margin that's much greater than the polls would normally have, it's clear that these are things that the American people have been in favor of. What do Democrats need to do in order to communicate that? Are they losing in a messaging war? Are the messengers themselves not effective? What's your analysis of why that message hasn't permeated?
I think it's all of the above. There's the actual substance of the policy hasn't been good enough. It hasn't delivered for enough people. We talk about the minimum wage, overwhelming support, but it hasn't been raised at the federal level for decades. It's still stuck at 725. So there's the policies themselves that the Democrats haven't done enough to focus on. They also haven't educated workers about them as much. So one example, as you've talked about Bidenomics and all these investments that President Biden made that attempted to sort of focus and improve conditions for working class. I went out and talked to a bunch of workers who were on one of these projects. This was in Tennessee, and the workers were thrilled. These were like the best jobs they'd ever had. They got into a union because of them. Their lives were transformed. These were people who didn't even have a bank account, and now we're talking about buying a house. So they were like, this thing is really working. But when I would ask them, well, how did it come to be? What is this? They would credit Ford Motor Company because they were working on an electric vehicle facility. They had no idea President Biden's policies were behind it. So that's clearly a messaging problem as well. So even the people most directly affected by some of these policies had no idea where it was coming from. And then the last element to me is you have to be able to reach people where they are. There's great divides in who reads newspapers and the like. And you and I might know a lot about all these little politics that are happening, but you have to find a way to reach people where they're at.
Right. Now, in the upcoming budget fight, how does the information that you've learned in this poll help Democrats to frame the issue? What should they be talking about? And what's the most effective way to communicate what this very cruel, very bizarre bill actually does?
Yeah. So I don't claim to be the biggest pollster or the biggest political pundit, but I have a lot of experience on working class policies and working class issues. And this is very clear that when you communicate, you have the ability to communicate this as harmful to workers. They are worried about their health care. And that really jumps out at all of the polling is that people don't want to lose their health care and they don't want their health care to be more expensive. And they're very worried about those things. So when you can communicate that to them, they immediately pay attention and are aware. And then when you add on, and it's doing so to benefit the rich and the wealthiest, they get angry. So that's where I would start now, exactly how to best do that. But talk about the harms to people that they're worried about and that you're helping rich people at your expense.
Now, Republicans have also propagated this notion that, this doesn't hurt rural people. This is just about urban people, meaning non white people, largely. But you finally have a situation where you have a lot of conservative Republicans from farm states saying, wait a second, Medicaid cuts, that's us. Rural hospitals, that's us. Talk a little bit about how these are issues that transcend urban, rural, big city, little city. This is really across the board problem that should be a concern to red state representatives, shouldn't it?
Well, it is a concern to red state representatives because the public cares about this desperately. And you can see that, I think, when, for a long time, the Affordable Care Act, or so called Obamacare, was seen and was just expanded in the blue states, the traditional Democratic states. But then for the past 5, 10 years, it's been expanded in red state after red state, especially when voters have a choice about whether they want more Medicaid, whether they want to have lower healthcare premiums alike. They support the policy, and so they've expanded these kind of the exact policies that are getting cut by this big beautiful bill were expanded in lots of red states very recently. So yeah, this is an all state problem. It's an every American problem, and it's clear, I think, that there's going to be some intra-party fighting within the Republicans about this. You alluded to the sort of Senator Hawley has written an op-ed saying this is really harmful. Cutting Medicaid like this is a red line for him. So I imagine that, and that's anyone that actually wants to represent their constituents and cares and has to worry about what their constituents thinks is not going to be in favor of these kinds of cuts.
Absolutely. Last question as we reach the end of our time. I want to go back because people's memories are so short. What were the kinds of policies that the Biden administration did that actually did benefit working class people? People were obviously upset about inflation. People who had jobs weren't that impressed that other people had gotten jobs. But in fact, a lot of the emphasis in that administration was on those people. So talk to us a little bit about the positive agenda that could be put forth that actually would help the lives of working class people.
Well, there's a lot, and Biden did a fair amount, and I'll start with that. But I also want to emphasize there's a lot more that needs to be done that Biden did not do. So what Biden did, for example, is he passed several bills that spent money on things like infrastructure, roads, bridges, but also new factories and the like. And for some of those policies, he conditioned that money saying you have to pay your workers well, the so-called prevailing wage for workers, and also had other kinds of benefits. And those mattered and were quite helpful for workers. He also increased the minimum wage for contracted workers. So people working on a government contract, especially like cleaning government office buildings, he increased their minimum wage. Big deal. They got like 20% wage increases. Unfortunately, Donald Trump just undid that because it was done through executive action. So Biden went to the picket line with unionized workers. This is almost unheard of in my lifetime and probably ever in American politics, where a sitting president goes out with striking workers to their picket line and supports them. And so this bully pulpit, he used the bully pulpit far more than most any president to support workers. Those are big steps forward. But he didn't do a lot of other things, and much of that is because he needs Congress to do things. And Congress didn't pass, for example, the PRO Act, which is, I think, the most important bill that right now, which this would allow workers to join unions and bargain collectively through a much simpler, fairer process than currently happens. The public now, over half of Americans say they would like to join a union, and 2/3, almost 70% of Americans say they support labor unions. Yet private sector union density, the share of the work of private sector that's in a union, is 6% today. That's the lowest it's been in over 100 years. And this huge difference between what the public wants and what they're getting is because the current law makes it almost impossible to form a union, where it lets the employer bully and boss you and prevent you from forming a union and bargaining collectively. So there's a lot of policy that would change that, and that didn't happen. And there's a lot of more things like that that need to happen.
And certain expansion of the child tax credit had a limit on it. He was not able to achieve sick pay. He was unable to achieve subsidies for healthcare, for childcare. I think that sounds like something that would put together an agenda that might be appealing to both the working class and college educated voters.
I agree. As you know, as we discussed, the working class and the college educated are deeply concerned about the condition of the economy. This is where they wake up thinking about, they're worried about it. Even if you have a college degree, things are not that good for you. You're worried about healthcare costs. You're worried about the cost of groceries, and your pay is not necessarily keeping up with all of that. So, an agenda that focuses on basic economic needs for workers really, I think, would do very well. And I would hope that any party would start to focus on
Well, thank you so much, David. Thank you for the work you're doing. And we will check back with you as this big but very ugly bill makes its way through. And we'll see if Republicans can figure out how they're going to defend the indefensible. So thank you so much. We'll see you again soon.
that. Thank you very much for having me.